Welcome everybody to our In Conversation it's actually our first In Conversation of the year here at Fourth Universalist. My name is Ember Kelly. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Religious Education for both, it's a lifetime, both kids and adults here at Fourth Universalist Society. And I'm really excited. This is kind of both, it's two things. This is the first of our In Conversations where we have a special guest speaker come in and share with us here at Fourth Universalist. But also we've had kind of an ongoing since last, about February or so, discussions about digital minimalism, about limiting our digital footprint, cutting down on digital addiction. And this to me kind of feels like also a little bit of a culmination of all of those discussions that were happening. And so I'm really excited tonight to welcome author and journalist Stephen Kurczy to be with us. Stephen, would you like to just give a brief introduction of yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ember, and thanks everybody for coming out. I feel like half the group here I know, Brett and Jody and Shirley and Abigail. Really nice to see you all. Thanks for doing this on a Tuesday night. So some of you know a lot about me already because I worked with you. So yeah, I've been a journalist since like 2005 when I graduated from Calvin College, which Ember and I, sorry. I was looking at your tag and I saw Ember Kelly, so I read the whole thing. So Ember and I, we both have like some overlap with Calvin. You were there in a couple years after me, right?
Yes, we were both in Grand Rapids roughly in like a same like decade-ish, I think is what we figured out when we were doing the podcast, because I moved to Grand Rapids in 2006 for Kuiper College, which was down the street, but then I went to Calvin Seminary. That was 2010. So I was officially on campus at Calvin in like 2010.
So we have this funny overlap about a decade and a half ago. And so I went into journalism and was working in Connecticut originally, and then in Cambodia for a bit, which is kind of mentioned in the book a couple of times. And I was in Brazil, and I came back to New York City, and I was doing a journalism fellowship at Columbia University, where when I started working on this book, maybe you all can like raise your hand so I know how much background to give and how much to say. Like, how many people here have like read the book or like know like general just like what it's about? 3, 4, yeah. Okay. Ember, do you want me to say a couple more things about the book right now?
Let me just go over just the rough outline of the event and the ground rules, and then we can do that. And so let's pull up our beautiful pre-prepared ground rules graphic. For some reason I'm using an iPad and it likes to sometimes jump to the end of my photos instead of the most recent photos. So while I'm sure that you all would enjoy baby photos of my oldest son, not the photo I was looking for. So ground rules for the space. This is an educational space, and we understand that disagreement may happen, but it's vital to practice respect. It's a liberatory space. We don't want to debate issues of oppression being real or not. We'll try to focus on voices from marginalized community and center those. And to respect our time and to keep discussion on topic, we ask that, at least at this beginning part, that you send your questions in the chat box. So we have our chat open. Feel free to leave questions there. We were talking about that we will be glad to like kind of pause our conversation and answer immediate questions there. But we will have a time after we finished our kind of pre-planned discussion to engage really any question verbally. We'll turn off the recording for that, so you don't got to worry that you're going to end up viral on a YouTube video or something like that. So we have that kind of structure that we're going to have just like an introduction to the book itself, and then some questions, and feel free to leave questions in the chat during all of that, and then a time for open discussion at the end. And so, Stephen, why don't you tell us a little bit about the book?
Okay. I want to say as well that like I've been doing a lot of like radio interviews over the past 8 weeks since the book came out, and that's like very much like a one-way conversation, or like me and like a radio jockey who has like 10 minutes to like hit like some real key bullet points. But there's not a whole lot of time for like actual substantial like back and forth, or like more nuanced questions, or more stuff that might be a little bit tangential. So I definitely welcome like any kind of questions you might want to put into the chat box, or if you want me to clarify something, I can do that. Anything at all, just to make it more of like a fun, free-flowing conversation. And again, thanks everyone for coming out on a Tuesday night to tune into this. So let's see. So I mentioned that I was doing that journalism program at Columbia University. I took this book writing class with a really great professor there at Columbia named Samuel Friedman. He's written a number of books, and it's a really hard book writing seminar to get into. There's like 100 students, 150 students, like all just in the informational section, and all like vying to get one of the 20 seats in the class. And so I kind of like elbowed my way in, and like through like a series of back and forth emails with him, like got in with this idea for a book about how I myself haven't owned a cell phone in at that point, it was like since 2009. So I still don't own a phone. So now it's been more than a decade. So it's like, what is my life like without a phone? And how is my cognitive, how are my cognitive processes, or how are my relationships with other people different because I don't have a phone? And kind of through the class, it developed into more of an idea of like immersion journalism, where I would go into a place where there is by law no cell service, and where there are legal restrictions on having cell phones or Wi-Fi or the kinds of wireless connectivity. And that was this place called Green Bank, West Virginia. And I found out about it just by doing a simple online search for places without cell service. And the first thing that popped up literally was Green Bank, West Virginia, because it's known as the quietest town in America. I meant to grab it from the other room, but I have a t-shirt from Green Bank, and it says on the t-shirt, the quietest town in America. And I have a hat, and it says Green Bank, and it says the quietest town in America. Like this is like the town's claim to fame. It really advertises itself as being a quiet place, as being the quietest place in the United States. And it's quiet it's naturally quiet, and it's quiet by state and federal laws, because it is home to the Green Bank Radio Astronomy Observatory, and it was founded there in 1956. So radio astronomy measures, it involves having these huge telescopes, like really giant, like TV dishes they look like, and they're collecting the very, very faint energy waves coming into Earth from the far reaches of the cosmos. And by looking at these radio waves, we can figure out what's happening out there. We can cosmic explosions and evidence for pulsars and complex molecules in space. Like we know there's formaldehyde floating around in space because you can see the radio waves given off by that formaldehyde. It's a specific frequency. And, it has to be radio astronomy and not microwave astronomy or, X-ray astronomy, because a lot of those other shorter wavelengths, they're filtered out by our atmosphere, hopefully. Because if X-rays and gamma rays were coming in, then we'd all be hurting right now. So, but radio waves, they are, we can't feel them, they're imperceptible, and they're coming in through the cosmos. So anyways, you can't pick up those radio waves if there's a lot of noise in the surrounding atmosphere, if you're getting a lot of interference. And so that's why the Radio Astronomy Observatory is here in Green Bank. Back in the 50s, when the National Science Foundation was deciding on where to put this astronomy observatory, they're like, what's the quietest suitable place in all the Eastern United States to build this facility? It was going to be America's very first federal radio astronomy facility. And Green Bank came out on top of like a short list of 30 places. And then the quiet around Green Bank was protected by state and federal laws. So in the same year, in 1956, West Virginia passed the State Radio Astronomy Zoning Act, which made it so that within a 10-mile radius of any radio astronomy facility, and Green Bank is the only one, it would be essentially illegal, punishable by a $50 daily fine, to emit any kind of electromagnetic interference that would interfere with the telescopes. And then 2 years later, in 1958, US Congress passed the National Radio Quiet Zone. And so this is a 13,000 square mile area, which is centered over Green Bank and another town called Sugar Grove, which we'll get into, I'm sure. It's this 13,000 square mile area where any kind of installations for anything that's going to emit electromagnetic radiation, it's a cell tower, it's a radio tower, it's really anything that needs an FCC approval, you have to get approval first from the Quiet Zone Administrator. And she's based at the Green Bank Observatory. for context, 13,000 square miles is pretty big. That's Connecticut and Massachusetts combined. And that's like there, like all over West Virginia, Virginia, and a little piece of Maryland. And most people have never heard of this, in part because it doesn't affect most people. Part of the quiet zone goes right to Charlottesville, the city of Charlottesville, where there's tens of thousands of people, and they're not really affected in any way. But it does mean that in Charlottesville, all the antennas, all the cell antennas there, for the most part, if you're on the part of Charlottesville that's inside the quiet zone, they're all facing away from Green Bank. But there's a hill right outside of Charlottesville where it's outside of the jurisdiction of the quiet zone. And that's where all the communications providers know to put their antennas facing toward Green Bank, because they're outside of the jurisdiction of the quiet zone. But then they can beam their transmissions into the quiet zone that way. So I went into Green Bank thinking quiet place, restrictions on connectivity, on cell service and Wi-Fi. And this is going to mesh perfectly with my own, feelings about living hyper-connected and my own desire to not have a smartphone or a cell phone. It's the case that today that 98% of Americans own cell phones, and most of them are smartphones. I mean, let's just have a raise of hands. Who here does not own a smartphone or a cell phone? Does anybody not own a smartphone? I see a toddler under the age of 5. It is okay. So there's 2 people in the chat who don't own cell phones. Me and Ember's son. Yeah, is that your son, Ember?
Yes. Oh, and he is a little bit older than 5. He's 7. I don't, got to defend his honor. But yes, he also does not have a cell phone.
So that's indicative of like where I stand in society. It's me and Ember's 7-year-old son. We're the only 2 who are a bit less connected. So it's like, where do I belong? Like, and over the years, I've gotten pressure from like employers, from family, from friends, like, get a cell phone, just get connected. And it's a mix of like me saying I don't want to because I don't like being pressured into doing things I don't like to, but increasingly it's become this kind of conviction that my life is no worse without a cell phone. And then for a lot of reasons, it's better without a cell phone, because a cell phone, or a smartphone, it's such a conduit for social media. Really, that's like the addictive aspect of the smartphone that like keeps us like touching it over and over again. And as evidenced by the Facebook files that's been coming out like over the past month or so from the Wall Street Journal, like Facebook is well aware of like the more nefarious aspects of its own platform and what it is doing to young people's lives and older people's lives, all of our lives, and the negative aspects of that. And it doesn't care because it knows it can make a buck off of like our obsessive social media habits. So for me, not having a smartphone, even though like I'm not a technophobe, I don't think, I have a laptop, I have 2 laptops, I even have an iPod, but like I just want to have like some space in my life with the online world. And for me, that's like when I'm outside of Wi-Fi, that means like I'm offline. So anyways, I went into Green Bank expecting to find a place where like this approach toward life would meet reality, where there was a town of people who would all share my, philosophical aversion to a life being always online. And that's like the intro to the book. That's what leads me into this place and into like a story where I find there's a town with actually a lot more going on besides it just being quiet. Is that clear enough for everybody?
As someone who read the book, I feel like it was a solid summary of a lot of the key parts. I did see some shocked looks about when you mentioned the iPod. It is, for context, it is the iPod Touch, because I think the regular iPods are particularly hard to get these days.
Even the iPod Touch was discontinued, I think, in 2017, and actually I have it right next to me. It's this, you've probably seen it. It's like the same model that came out in like 2013. But it was discontinued. And so I still had like my old like 2015 model or whatever. It was the case like when I unplugged it from the battery, from the whatever is charging up, like it automatically went down to 5% battery. So like it was a very limited device, like for being like a total portable device. Right. My mother-in-law has since bought me a new iPod. She found it very curious. I was asking for an iPod as a 30, I'm a 38-year-old now. As a 38-year-old asking for an iPod rather than just asking for a new smartphone or an iPhone.
At
But
the
such is my life.
at the same time, I think that there's a bit of a nostalgia for the early 2000s iPods. I know I myself have been like, oh man, kind of wish I just had a device that was only music, um, because that same desire to disconnect from things. For context, for those who aren't Fourth Universalist affiliated, I did a little challenge over Lent where I switched to a non-smartphone, and people do like to call them dumb phones, brick phones. So I switched to a non-smartphone, and I actually did keep that all the way through July. As we started to come back to in person at church, it was just too hard with the amount of text messaging that I was doing. It was really hard to do the sit there and type out all the keys. It was just not working in my favor. And I've also gotten a bit back into. I'd also taken off of all social media, and then was at first just like, okay, I'm only going to use it like once a week. And TikTok has broken me. That has been my most recent trouble area. But I mean, I think it's a real thing that, like as you pointed out, with like these recent leaks, recent inquiries into Facebook, that this is causing real changes to the way people communicate. Our October theme to our education is about relationship, and I think cell phones have a real impact on people's relationships. Social media has a real impact on social relationships. Um, uh, did that change a lot for like when you got to Green Bank? Was it this magical wonderland, or was there someone hiding behind the wizard's curtain?
It's just like what I found there different from what I'd read.
So was it this place where you were removed from social media, where you were removed from having to worry about uh, the connection, the ruining of connections that the internet and the social media is bringing us?
So that was actually a question that I personally couldn't answer for my own life. And that was actually a challenge in general for me approaching the book. Like, was I the best person to write this book, given that I don't have a cell phone and I'm not really on social media? Wouldn't the best person to write this book have been somebody who's like super addicted to their smartphone, has several, has them like hanging on, like around their neck on a necklace, and who's like addicted to their social media? That person going into Green Bank, they would really feel right, like they're hitting the wall, like they're really in a place where things have changed, and they would be forced to confront their addiction to their devices and to like them like not being on it. For me, it was like a different reason for going in. It was like a little bit more organic. It wasn't just like a test of like what's going to be like for this, addicted person. I feel like it's more like that's like it was less gimmicky. It was less like game show throwing the kid into the ball of water with the alligators. It was more, me looking for people who would share my feelings toward hyperconnectivity and all of that. Ember and I were talking a little bit offline about this aspect of like relationships, and there was this irony to the fact that like when I went into Green Bank, I had a lot of expectations to the place about how connected it was, about how people there lived with or without smartphones, with or without Wi-Fi. And I had those expectations and those preconceptions because of everything I'd read in the media, on Twitter or whatever. Like my preconceptions about this place were filtered through this lens of social media and the news, which I get to the online world. And those preconceptions were that this is a place where Wi-Fi was illegal and nobody had it, where smartphones were illegal and nobody had it, where people were getting fined $50 a day for not, for emitting interference toward the telescopes. But then going into Green Bank, I was required to break away from that feed and to start having conversations with people and just knocking on doors and meeting with them in person, just hanging out at the local general store for hours at a time behind the 90-year-old cashier, Betty, who'd been working there for like over half a century, since like the 1960s. She's worked at this one general store and just kind of like hanging out there, talking to people as I came and went, having going to like random funerals and stuff like that for people, and lots of church services I went to. And it was through those relationships I started building with people that I started peeling behind the facade of this being a super quiet place and finding out that, hang on, it seems like everybody does have Wi-Fi. It can't be illegal if everybody has it, right? Hang on, everybody does seem to have a cell phone, and many of them do have smartphones. And there does seem to be cell service, not in Greenbank itself, but like right around the town, like inside the quiet zone. And so the irony was that like to like I had to get offline and have real relationships with people there in Greenbank to find out how online they all actually were with their devices, and to peel back that facade, right, of how quiet or not quiet the place actually was.
Right, there's oftentimes with much more so usually with like traveling to foreign places, that it's like, oh, they're just putting on an act for you. But it seems like based on the story, comparing that to like a lot of the reporting, the more sensationalist, like BuzzFeed articles, like the town without Wi-Fi, where it makes it sound like, there's literally someone driving around in a truck hunting you down for making sure that you're not using Wi-Fi or a cell phone. That it's not really like that once you get there.
To that point, they're sort of, there used to be a guy, but he hasn't been doing his thing. So there was this guy named Wesley, and for a while, for decades, he would actually drive around Greenbank in this radio interference tracking truck looking for renegade signals. This is back in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s. And, it used to be that those interfering signals would come from an arcing electric fence that's supposed to be keeping in the cows, or from a malfunctioning, radio stereo. And, he would pick up some static from it, and that static is polluting the radio quiet there. And he would knock on the person's door and say, hey, can I fix your fence? Can I fix your radio? Can I fix your TV? Because, you're going to get better reception. It's going to work. Your instruments are going to work better when I fix it. And you're not going to be interfering with the telescopes. But now that people are bringing in purposeful, intentional transmitters like Wi-Fi, like smartphones, like a Bluetooth, like my wife's Bluetooth headphones, which these would be against the rules to have at the Greenbank Observatory. And if I had them anywhere in Greenbank, they would be polluting the airways toward the telescopes. Like these would be a problem in Greenbank, just something as simple as this. So this would be the kind of thing that guy Wesley would be able to pick up with his, instruments on his truck, and he'd say, hey, Steve, you got to turn those off. But in recent years, like in the last decade, it's become the case, I found, that so many people are bringing in Wi-Fi routers. Frontier Communications is installing Wi-Fi routers at anybody's house who wants them. So many people are bringing in Bluetooth and all kinds of other wireless technology that the observatory has lost the ability to control it all. And they've lost a lot of cooperation from the community, like their cooperation, their willingness to play along with the rules for the sake of the observatory. And you can imagine probably where these people are coming from. Like on the one hand, it's remote Appalachia. It's a fairly impoverished area. And so to have this world-class radio astronomy facility bringing in super smart scientists, this really high-tech technology, like for context here, at the Greenbank Observatory is the world's largest fully steerable radio telescope. It's 330 feet by 360 feet diameter. It's 2 acres inside. It's like 2 football fields just sitting up in the air 500 feet. It's like there in remote Appalachia. It's wildly impressive to drive, around the mountain bend and into this gorgeous valley of green pastures, and to see this giant white telescope there. And that telescope brings a lot of money into the community. It also brings in like educators into the community. So to lose that would be a real hit to that community. But still, they want Wi-Fi. They want Wi-Fi, even though that's threatening the future of this observatory that brings so much into the community. And that says so much about all of our lives, right? And people there as well. It's like, I'm willing to hurt myself. I'm willing to hurt my community. I'm willing to hurt this source of such strength for where I live, just so that I can have Wi-Fi or have a smartphone to be connected a little bit more.
Right. It's some level of the keeping up with the Joneses. You can't, like I think it's actually the illustration either just from our podcast discussion or from in the book itself. That everybody's moving in the fast lane, and they feel like they're just not even on the road at all. They want to at least be. They may not have the fastest internet in the world. They may still have their restrictions, but they have a hard time like feeling left out when the rest of the world is moving on so quickly.
And like we can't like who can blame them, right? Especially during the pandemic, where we've all been stuck behind our screens. We've been realizing how essential, this technology and Zoom is like for our lives. Like this stuff is really valuable and we need it to have jobs, to keep up with what's happening out there. And especially like in a place like in Appalachia, where you don't have a whole lot of other resources, like that online connection is super important. And I should add an asterisk here. Like I am tethered to my internet right now. I have a cable going into my laptop. That would be totally fine to have in Green Bank. You can have internet, and some of the fastest internet in all of Appalachia is at the Green Bank Observatory. They have like a dedicated fiber optic line going all the way to Morgantown, where the University of West Virginia is. They have super high tech stuff there. You just can't have wireless internet. You just can't have wireless connections. So it forces you all to be a little bit more tethered, and to be like online through a cable. I just like I need to make that clarification because, I mean, the New York Times itself had an article in 2019 called "The Land Where the Internet Ends." As if like there's no internet in Green Bank or in the quiet zone. There's just so much like misreporting about this place and about like, and maybe it's not surprising, like because we equate cell service and Wi-Fi with internet. If you can't have that, well, how can you get on internet? You just got to have a cable.
Right. And so compared to a lot of these articles that, to put it in those terms, when I got recommended to connect with you, when I got recommended the book, when I got a chance to read it, as someone who'd been kind of studying a little bit about digital minimalism, I thought maybe that it would just kind of be that kind of focus. But one of the things that I loved and that really drew me in with the story was the relationships that you went there. I have family in Appalachia in Pennsylvania, and it felt a little bit like being on the farm growing up. And it felt like real relationships that you were forming with folks. How was that experience for you? Like actually going there and really getting connected. What was that like for you?
There's a challenge to that because obviously I was working on a book, so I was trying to create relationships, and I know so many more people in Green Bank and around the surrounding county of Pocahontas County than I do in my own town here in Connecticut, where I live in Northeast Connecticut, just because like I'm not writing a book about Woodstock. So like it's a little bit disingenuous for me to say, oh, I have these rich connections and relationships with everybody in Green Bank because of it being disconnected. Like in part, it's because I was working on a book about it. But there is a real sense of like being forced to have more connections there with people because you're not going to be always online, because for the most part, internet is super slow there. Even though people are trying to break the rules and have Wi-Fi, internet is so slow that like you just can't, it's not functional. It's so slow for like a lot of people in Green Bank, depending on where you live and how close to like the internet cables you are. And that forces you to like, pick up the phone or to like linger at the general store or to like go to a neighbor's house and actually have more relationships, have more in-person conversations if you want to, like if you want to have any kind of a connection with people. And we could probably all think back to our own lives 20 years ago, right? Before cell phones, like, and how that was probably the case. Like you're at the store and you're waiting in line to check out, and maybe you're a little bit more likely to initiate a conversation if you don't have your smartphone that you can go down and look at and like be texting with somebody. And I know that's true even in my own life, because even though I don't have a smartphone, and that's like my own attempt to like create some kind of like quiet barrier, I do have that iPod, and I'm always like sneaking around trying to find like Wi-Fi hotspots, and like break the rules in my own life. Like, and I feel like a hypocrite when I do that, but I also feel like this is the reality of like the powerful addictiveness and the powerful pull of these devices and what's online, that like even myself, like I'm trying to sneak around and get on this. It just reinforces for me why I don't have a smartphone because I know I'd be like even more worse at all the time. So yeah, there was this sense there of like the necessity of being offline more, forcing you to create or have more relationships.
I mean, that being said, it also does, being such a remote place, it attracts unique folks of many different varieties. Would you like to talk about some of the more unique folks and more unique groups that you came in contact with, Leather?
Yeah. I mean, asterisk that and bump it down. And first, I want to say it's like after 7:30, so I don't want to run out of time without having some conversations with you all and like taking questions. So feel free to start like pounding in those questions in the chat box. And there was one comment/question from Brett, which says, I was struck by the high degree of cooperation with the folks at the observatory. Totally. And that was a really cool thing for a journalist, especially because this is like our nation's very first fellow radio astronomy observatory. Some of the smartest and best radio astronomers in the world are there in Green Bank. And so for me, it was like, what's going on here? I can just go in and wander up and down the hallways and knock on some guy's door and start talking to them. I can just wander down to the basement and talk to the quiet zone administrator and find out like what kind of applications she's looking on from major communications providers who want to install their stuff all around the 13,000 square mile quiet zone. Like, I think there was this aspect of like, there's not a whole, like there's a lot of media written about this place, but not a lot of media just sticks around. And I think that was kind of confusing to people. Like, getting back to the idea of developing relationships, I spent 4 months in Green Bank over a period of 3 years. When you kind of spread it out like that, I'd be there for a month and gone for a few months, but I'd pop back in for a month and people like, oh, he's been here the whole time. He must have purchased a house in Green Bank now. And I think some of them thought I was just like working at the observatory because like I'd just be roaming up and down the hallways talking to people. And so that gave me a lot more access and willingness like of other people to like speak with me and to share, hey, actually, I do have Wi-Fi, even though I wouldn't say so much to most other journalists when they pop through. And that's the reality about the thing about people lying about Wi-Fi or not. Like, I found real examples of locals having said, I don't have Wi-Fi or I don't have a smartphone, and then finding out that actually they do have Wi-Fi, they do have a smartphone. Okay, there's a clarify. Abby says, people have Wi-Fi in their homes, but no Wi-Fi. So they can't have wireless internet in their homes, or it's just public Wi-Fi, or Wi-Fi is okay, but not cell signal. Okay. No, it's good. It's a good question, because this is like where a lot of like nuance comes into the whole thing. So let's get back to those. So back in 1956, there was this law passed, the state West Virginia Radio Astronomy Zoning Act. And in 1956, there was no Wi-Fi. There was no cell service. There were no smartphones. So there's nothing specific in that law that says you can't have Wi-Fi, you can't have smartphones. Ever since then, it's just been the observatory interpreting the law and telling the community what they can and can't have. And so when Wi-Fi came around, the observatory said, this would interfere with us, therefore you can't have it. However, within the actual observatory and radio astronomy community, there's debate and disagreement over if that is how that law can be interpreted. So I spoke with like the head of like radio spectrum allocations at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, and also the former assistant site director of the Green Bank Observatory. And they both said, no, the state law would not cover Wi-Fi. It wouldn't cover Wi-Fi because Wi-Fi is under the jurisdiction of the Federal Communications Commission. So that would be a federal jurisdiction, and state law couldn't tell, it would be like superseding its powers if it tried to interfere with like a federal governed Wi-Fi. So that said, publicly, the observatory says you can't have Wi-Fi, but they never actually press the issue, because even within the observatory, there is this disagreement over if it would pass any muster in a court of law. I mentioned that there's this $50 daily fine for any rule breakers within a 10-mile radius. Nobody has ever actually been fined $50. They never actually gone to the county prosecutor and said, we know this specific person is breaking the law, we're going to start fining them $50. They never wanted to like press it that far or let it get into a court of law, because then you would have actual lawyers having a legal debate over what this state law means. This state law, which some of the astronomers actually believe might be illegal. Like, they think the state law is like, it's almost like unconstitutional, because it infringes on what the federal jurisdiction is over some of these devices. So anyways, all that said, publicly, the observatory and any articles you read about this place, it's probably going to say Wi-Fi is illegal according to the state law. But the observatory isn't pressing that. And so many people around Green Bank in their homes, and when I say many, I mean, like everybody. At last count, there was like almost 200 Wi-Fi signals in the Green Bank area. There's not even 200 homes in the Green Bank area. So it's like, where's all the Wi-Fi even coming from? So did that answer your question about, is it possible to unmute other people, Ember, at this point?
I can hop in and change some settings. I will go ahead and.
Okay, Abby gave you the thumbs up. So
okay.
And let's see, was there another question? Brett says, have you received feedback from the residents of Green Bank since you outed them as maybe not as disconnected as they had advertised? Have you heard from the National Front about your portrayal of them? So to the first question, so back in early September, I spent another 10 days in Green Bank, in the Green Bank area. It was like about a month after the book had come out. And hey, you can speak now, Brett, if you want to add on that. I think you're unmuted.
I unmuted Brett since it was his question.
Yeah. I was just, because you were saying earlier, they had T-shirts and a whole brand around this disconnectedness, which, I don't want to give away the book for anyone who hasn't read it, but you just said that, really not true. And I'm wondering what the reaction was to that when you were there on a book tour.
Positive, because for the most part, like, they're not trying to lie to the media. It's like, there's so much misportrayals about this place, often because it's just like this ball that's rolling, and a journalist like reads the story and like continues rolling with it, right? And so like they go there looking for evidence that people don't have Wi-Fi, or they just assume it, or they find the one person who says I don't have Wi-Fi. But like everybody else isn't super happy about these misportrayals about this place, because it often seems like the same collection of like a dozen people are interviewed for a lot of these articles, but like you break outside of those dozen people and like you find a lot more voices, and those voices are happier about like a more nuanced portrayal about this place. So nobody was unhappy about being outed, or about Green Bank itself being outed as being more connected than like the media portrayal of it. I think there was a lot of surprise within the observatory. I think the observatory found it somewhat shocking how much Wi-Fi there is in the community, and how everybody in the community thinks that Wi-Fi is not illegal, and how everybody in the community thinks that, if Wi-Fi was really a problem, the observatory would do something about it. And if it doesn't do something about it, therefore it can't be a problem. I think that was shocking for the observatory. And it did spark some like tough internal discussions within the observatory. A bigger pushback from the observatory was my portrayal of it being a front for sugar growth. So I mentioned a couple minutes ago how the National Radio Quiet Zone, that 13,000 square mile area, covers Green Bank and a nearby town called Sugar Grove, which is the site of this shady, secretive military post where the National Security Agency, which is the spy arm of the Department of Defense, it operates a collection of about a half dozen radio antennas, which are monitoring this conversation, which are basically swooping in all the emails and texts and wireless communications on the East Coast. It's been called our country's largest eavesdropping bug. And that work is only possible because it's protected by the quiet zone. Like, you need the quiet to do radio astronomy and to hear those signals, but you also need the quiet to be able to monitor all the radio noise, from everybody on their smartphones or on their devices that were sending the communications. And I portrayed, or I was led to believe, and it really is the case, that Sugar Grove is, it hides behind Green Bank. The public face of the quiet zone is Green Bank. It's the observatory. Most any article you read about this place, most anything you read online about this place, this is the quiet zones for the Green Bank Observatory, without ever mentioning Sugar Grove. But Sugar Grove is the real power behind the quiet zone. It's arguable if the quiet zone even exists, if the military wasn't using it for its spy purposes, for its communications purposes, as well, with like its fleets of ships out to sea. That's what it's also been used for there at Sugar Grove. So like there is a real sense of Green Bank being a front, being the public face, being what the US government wants everybody to think that the quiet zone is about, because who isn't on board with astronomy? It's so cool. It's Neil deGrasse Tyson. It's it's Cosmos. It's Jodie Foster in the movie Contact. Asterisk as well. Like, if anybody's seen Contact, that's modeled after a radio astronomer who actually worked in Green Bank and on the search for extraterrestrial intelligence using radio astronomy, which is still done there in Green Bank. They're actually looking for aliens out there in Green Bank, which is also this wonderful little tangent about how, like, we need quiet for relationships. We also need quiet if we want to develop relationships with extraterrestrials. Like, the quietest place in the world is going to be the first one to know if ET is out there, because they're actually listening for ETs, these super quiet radio telescopes. So yeah, there has been pushback from the observatory over my portrayal of them being a front for sugar growth. Another question you had, the part two, was about you said, have I heard from the National Front about your portrayal of them? I think you mean the National Alliance, which is this fairly infamous neo-Nazi organization, which kind of ties back to Ember's question as well. So I'll kind of loop them both together. Ember was saying, there have been a lot of people and groups attracted to the quiet that I found in the quiet zone. So since the quiet zone was created back in the 50s, there's this real element of, like, people and groups seeking a piece of that quiet, like going to the quietest place in America because it provides, like, a place where they can get away from it all. And that, that really embodies what the radio astronomers wanted. They wanted to get away from it all, from all the radio noise, from all the people. It's a super sparsely populated area. The whole county of Pocahontas, it's like 8,000 people in a Rhode Island sized area. It's one of the most sparsely populated counties in, like, east of the Mississippi. So if you want to, like, get quiet, you go to Pocahontas County, you go to the quiet zone. And that appealed to the radio astronomers, it appealed to the government spies over in Sugar Grove. And in the 80s, it also appealed to this infamous group of neo-Nazis called the National Alliance, led by William Luther Pierce, who is considered the godfather of the modern white power movement. Pierce was the author of the Turner Diaries, which has been called the Bible to the racist right. It was one of the motivating texts for Timothy McVeigh in the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. That book was actually found in his getaway car from Oklahoma City. And it's continued to be a motivating text for, like, dozens of other hate incidents around the world. The neo-Nazis, went to the quiet zone to get away from it all, to get away from all the noise, to get away from minorities, from civil rights groups, from law enforcement that could monitor them in a city, in a quiet, super quiet place. They could, for worse, I was going to say for better, for worse, but it's just for worse, develop their relationships, have their echo chambers, and not be bothered with, like, their nefarious activities out there. I sent a copy of the book. There was one particular source who I met repeatedly at the National Alliance compound, which is still there in Pocahontas County. I spent, like, many, many days there talking with them, trying to find out what they're up to, and also trying to find out, like, are they going to mount a resurgence? The group has really faded a lot since its founder, William Pierce, died in the early 2000s, but is it going to be able to mount a resurgence, as it would love to do, on the back of this surge in, hate incidences, really exemplified by the Charlottesville Unite the White rally in 2017, which was, like, around when I first went to Green Bank, when, one person actually died when a self-avowed neo-Nazi drove his car into a group of counter-protesters. Like, there was a real sense when I was there of there being a rise in hate crimes, and of the National Alliance, being able to, like, ride it to, like, prominence. That's another plot line through the book over what quiet could provide to this neo-Nazi hate group. I sent a copy of the book to one of my main sources, David Pringle, and he responded saying, trying to put it in his words. He didn't say looks good, but he said, it's interesting to read this from your point of view. It's all accurate so far. And we haven't been in contact since. But yeah, no pushback from the National Alliance. Yeah, it's, they don't care. I don't know how many, how much those guys really read. There's also, there's this, for me personally, it's like walking a fine line between shining light on this group and what they're doing, and also not giving them, oxygen not giving them needless press in my book and giving them more attention than they deserve. And so, like, I guess I would think that that's factoring into their reaction to the book. Like for these guys, I'm sure to a large extent, any press is good press, and that's kind of scary for me to think. So, you know, I want all the coverage of the book I can get, but maybe the less reaction there is to the National Alliance part, the better for that reason.